Welcome back. It's the Marketer of the Day podcast with very special guest Trevor Oldham, who helps alternative investment companies grow their business through proven podcast guesting strategies. But as we'll find out from our conversation here, Trevor and his company are on the path to world domination. They're looking into many of these other things. So Trevor is here to talk to you about his company, podcastyou.com, which was very necessary for outstanding alternative investment companies to have the opportunity to spread their narrative on high-ranking podcasts. So we'll find out what all the fuss is about, what Trevor does that is unique, and so much more. So Trevor, glad to be speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Super excited to be on the show today and excited to provide some value to your audience.
Likewise. And so we mentioned you a little bit and your company, but in your own words, like what are you currently focusing on and what has you just super excited?
Yeah, most certainly. So our primary focus is we really work with folks. I say it's been in the real estate investment industry, but lately we've been branching out beyond the investment industry into it's all to your alternative investments. So it's basically where you can invest your money that's not going to be in your typical stock market. And like really what we do for our clients and our bread and butter is just going out there and getting them booked on podcasts. So whether it's a real estate investor or it's someone like a company we work with where you can invest in barrels of whiskey, where like a minimum investment's like 50K. With them, it's been pretty cool. But I mean, over the last 7 years, we worked in so many different niches. I mean, early on, it was like we would take on any client that we could, whether they were in real estate, if they were an entrepreneur, if they were a business owner, a lawyer, a politician we even worked with, and even like health coaches. So we had to niche down over the last couple of years because we realized I know it was so hard because we would take on a new client in a new niche, and then we have to go and find a whole new array of podcasts for to go out there and try to get them a guest on. Where like now with this specific niche, it makes it easier because we have those pre-established relationships. So that was a big part of why we like the real estate. And then we're like, okay, like what can we do more than just real estate, but not spread ourselves too thin? And then that's where these alternative investments come. Because I mean, when you're working with entrepreneurs, there's so many different businesses out there, and each has a different sort of audience. So it was a ton of work early on. We're like, hey, let's just go and pick on one specific niche. Hopefully it works out. And obviously, of course it has, but that was a big thing, was just picking the niche and really just sticking to it.
I like that. And also there's that aspect of it that you mentioned of like when you're expanding your niche, try to make it connect in some way, right? Like you got the podcast guesting clients and you were like all over the place, but now it makes sense to just go real estate investing people, so that way you can just use that Rolodex. But then expanding out from real estate investing, it's not like you were going into something crazy. You're like, well, other like types of alternative investing, so that way it's still connected in some sort of way. And you're making me think that over the years, I've had all these cool guests that talk about some of these alternative investments, like guys that own laundromats or sell storage units or just all these things that you otherwise wouldn't have thought of, like so-called boring businesses. And also as far as the podcast guesting goes, I know like I'm kind of weak in that area. Like I've got this show that you're on as we speak. I think we've got like 1150 episodes. And so like, over 1,000. But then as far as me being on shows, I think I've only been on like maybe like 35, 40 shows. And I don't know. And I guess it's works out anyway because people come to me. But like, tell us, what's the sort of sales pitch as far as podcast guesting? Like there's the SEO domination and the networking, but like, what's the real exciting part about being on other people's podcasts?
Yeah, I think you mentioned two great points there, but I think more often than not, just being able to generate leads from going on other people's podcasts, that's usually the number one reason people like to go on podcasts. And then outside of that, you get the brand awareness, the brand recognition, you get the networking aspect of it, like getting to meet other podcast hosts. And then like you mentioned, the SEO aspect of it, where a lot of the times you'll get nice backlinks to your site, and that drives up the SEO factor of it. And yeah, I think really just the biggest thing is it really goes back to the brand recognition and then the driving the leads for your company. And that's really why people like to go. And honestly, there's probably that little bit of an ego boost per se. So someone can say, hey, I was just a guest on a podcast, or I've been on X amount of podcasts. It makes you sound nice and professional. And a lot of our clients, they'll take their interviews and they'll have a media section on their website, and they'll put all their interviews right on there. So if they have a potential client or a potential customer, they can go over and see like, okay, this guy's been interviewed on 50 podcasts. He must know what he's talking about. He must be an expert at whatever that person does. So it helps you to build up that credibility. And I think there's just like that aura around it, like, okay, this guy's getting interviewed. He must know what he's talking about. And again, it just goes back to building up that credibility yourself. Again, not to say every podcast guest is credible or trustworthy, but for the majority of them, it does give you that nice little extra boost.
Right. It's you've at least gone through that hurdle. You've at least proven yourself in that way. And that's a hot tip right off the bat is having that page on your site showing all the other podcasts you've been on. And like I'm amazed at how many podcast guests don't even have that, right? Like I'll have
Mhm.
some email come in saying like, hey, do you want this person on your show? Check out their website. But then so often, so I mean, if I just had that, I could just go and find some shows they've been on, watch a quick video and be like, oh, here's what the person is all about. And that's very doable, right? And a great credibility booster, especially if someone is just like doing their research on you, right? If they're looking, say you're that real estate investor and you're looking to make some kind of a deal happen. If there's that web page, there's the extra credibility factor. And so when you have let's say just like real estate people who want to guest on podcasts who find you, what's the before picture like? Do they usually have never been on podcasts or they're used to it or need to be sold on the idea? Like what is a typical client who comes to you, who you onboard? What's their current status?
Yeah, usually it's about someone that's been on anywhere from usually about 2 to 5 podcasts. So they've been on a podcast before. They understand what it is. We've had clients that haven't been on a podcast before, but it's just honestly the sales pitch. It's just a little bit harder because someone doesn't understand the full benefit of it. They don't understand exactly what it is. And not to say we haven't worked with someone that has never been on a podcast before, but it's just easier if someone's been on 2 to 5 podcasts. So that's our sort of our first criteria of people that we work with. Maybe they've been asked to go on a few shows, or maybe they've had someone on their team reach out and they're just not sure what to do, which is obviously why they would hire our company to help them get booked on more shows. And then conversely, we have a client where like we recently took on a client, they've been on 120 podcasts. So they hire us because they're like, we don't know what other shows are out there. We don't know how to find more shows. Obviously that client's a little bit trickier at the end of the day. When they've been on 120 shows, you have to make sure that you're not pitching shows that they've already been on. Where the one that's been on 2 to 5, there's a boatload of shows ready to go out there and try to get them booked on. But yeah, that's our typical client. Usually, again, it's usually someone that has an understanding of what a podcast is, and the reason that they work with our company is that because they've been on a podcast, they've seen results and they want to get more results. They're just really unsure about how to find podcasts, how to contact them, how to do something as simple as putting together a pitch to the podcast host, and just simple things like that.
And you're mentioning here that it is simple, but it's quite tedious, right? There's a lot
Mhm.
involved of like going through and finding these shows and sending your speaker sheet and following up and then following up after and all those other things. And so we can definitely see how it helps to have a team like yours say like, hey, here's all these shows that we can get you on. And so what's the typical sort of like setup? Do guests like to be on like one show a month or one show a week? Because like the objection that comes up is like, well, will this like take over my life? Will this be like
Mhm.
such an extra chore I have to do? So like, what do people usually tell you, or what do you do as far as like how often they appear on shows?
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually it's about once a week to one every 1.5 weeks, depending on what the client's looking to. So as an example, like our packages are either we'll book our clients on 4 interviews a month or 6 interviews a month, depending on what they're looking to do. But more often than not, people are doing that 4 interview per month package. So you can imagine that works out to about an interview per week. And then usually when someone's doing an interview, I tell them just block an hour off on your calendar just to be safe. Usually most interviews don't go longer than an hour. So they find that typically works best for our clients. But that is definitely a worry that people have. Like, how long is it going to be? They think of like, say, like the Joe Rogan podcast where it's like 2 or 3 hours. They're like, I can't block a whole afternoon off for a podcast. But it's like, no, like usually most interviews are 20 to 30 minutes. But again, that is take an hour just because sometimes you might chat before the interview. Sometimes you might chat a little while after the interview just to make sure like the last thing you want to do is block 30 minutes off and then you're like scrambling like, okay, like I really gotta I really gotta end this interview. But yeah, long story short, most of our clients are usually doing about one interview per week, and they find that's what works best with their schedule.
Yeah, and that's definitely very doable, right? That's an easy enough habit, but also you're doing enough interviews where it's moving the needle. And I'm right there with you as far as blocking out the whole hour because you never know if like either person might be 5 minutes late. I think
Mm.
you and I chatted for like 7 minutes before we hit record. We'll probably just have a last little chat afterwards. And then sometimes you say, well, we end up going a little bit long, right? We plan for like 20 minutes, might be like 30, 35 minutes. So makes sense to not be that back to back. Plus, maybe you need to like take a little bit of a break and reset the brain and all those sorts of things. Don't want to be jumping from one thing to the other. And so that's good to know is like more or less one interview per week to kind of get some results from that. And like, what do you wish that your clients knew? Or like, what are maybe like the surprises that present themselves when they start this process with you?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is just the timeline of the interviews. I think that's a thing where initially starting off, it could be a lot of times you're booking an interview per se. Sometimes the interview might be booking out, let's say a week or two out. So now you're looking at a week or two out from when you get the booking link. And then sometimes the interview might not go live for 4 to 6 weeks from that time point. So the time that you get booked on the show till the time the interview actually goes live could be anywhere. I usually say on average 6 to 8 weeks, give or take. Sometimes it might be shorter, sometimes it might be longer, depending on the podcast. And I think people think, like with podcasting, I'm going to go on the show and it's going to be live tomorrow. Yeah, sometimes that might happen, but more often than not, it's going to be a little while before the interview comes out. And I think people expect it to be like, I'm going to see results like the first day that I do it. And it's like, no, like we're not like Google ads where you could drop in a budget and you can tell right away whether you have results within like a week. It's going to take a little while. I think people sometimes don't realize when they're starting podcast guesting that like, oh, like sometimes you might get a link to book an interview and they're not booking until another month or two out. And that's just, there's nothing that we can do as our company. It's just up to the podcast host themselves. But I think people get surprised by that. And that's probably something I wish more people would understand is just that sometimes it might just be a little while before you get these interviews. And what I say is like once you're podcast guesting, it really takes about 2 to 4 months for you to start seeing results because then once you're into month 1 and 2, then months 3 and 4, maybe your interviews start to go live. And then you can actually start to see those results coming in. So it's definitely like a long process. Again, it's not something that's like you do one podcast and you're going to see results right away. It could take a little while. And I think people sometimes get, I don't know about frustrated, but they're like, how come this interview hasn't gone live yet? Well, it's like, well, they interviewed 8 other people before you, so they have to wait for those interviews to go live. So I think there's just sometimes people don't understand that aspect of it, that it just because they did an interview, it could take a little while for the interview to go live.
Fair enough. And I can definitely see why they would think that, right? They think like, well, if I'm interviewed on the morning news, then it goes live like the same day or it goes like if not live. And you're saying like, well, in the podcast world, there's other shows, there's like the production and the SEO titles and the podcast notes, like takes a while to figure out all those things out. Might be a few days, might be a few weeks until it goes live, and just all the more reason to make it a consistent habit and keep doing it. And so you say that, so your typical client has been on podcasts before, and do any mistakes come to mind as far as like the podcast that they've been on? There's probably a reason why they've only been on one or two and then kind of quit and then needed an organized team like yours to do it. And so like what sort of mistakes do you see people making when they're guesting on podcasts?
I would say the biggest one is just going on the wrong shows that just don't make sense for what they're looking to do. So to like give you an example within the real estate space, we might have a multifamily investor and they're looking to raise capital to buy apartments and they just want to go on any general real estate show. And then now they somehow get accepted and they're going on a show that's teaching the audience how to flip houses. That's just flipping houses and buying apartment complexes. They're two different things, but that's really what I see as people just going on the wrong sort of shows that aren't hitting their target audience or what they're looking to achieve. That's honestly the biggest thing that I see. People just want to go on any podcast that's out there. And it's like, yeah, you could. I mean, there's like 2 million podcasts out there. I'm sure there'll be some that want to have you on as a guest, but like, does it make sense for you and your time? Are you spending the right amount of time on the show? Does it have the right target audience? And I think that's the biggest mistake that I see. Outside of that, it would be not having a website that's set up to have like book a discovery call or a lead magnet, anything like that. It's just like it's almost like a static web page where no one can get more information. They don't know how to like book a call or anything like that. So it's like someone listens to you on a podcast, now they're interested in what you have to say or have to offer, and they want to learn more. And then they go to your website, and either it's not professionally, maybe it's done, but it's not professionally designed. It doesn't look really professionally done, or they just don't know how to get in contact with you. Because someone listens to you on a podcast, maybe they look you up right then and there, wherever they are, and then there's no way to get in contact with you, and then that's sort of the end of it. And then I would say probably the third mistake that someone has or is really just making sure they have the right podcasting equipment. And what I mean by that is making sure they have a good quality podcast mic. So like when we're working with our clients, I'll be, hey, do you have a podcast microphone? And they'll be like, no, I have AirPods. Be like, you really just got to get a good. I don't know, what I mean by good is like you could spend like 50, $100 and get a decent podcast microphone. Obviously, you could spend more than that, but that's another area where people underestimate. Like, okay, do I actually need a mic? Do I not need a mic? You just want the sound quality to be good for both you, for the host. If you're spending your time on these interviews, the host doesn't want to have his team, whether it's himself or themselves or their team, going back and editing the show and the sound quality is just terrible, where they can't even produce the show. No one wants that. So that's a couple of big mistakes. Outside of that would be making sure when you're doing the interview, you're in a quiet place. I find not so much all the time our clients, but like they might be in an office and there's background noise. It's like you just got to make sure you're quiet, because if you have a good mic, it's going to pick up everything in the background. So those are the couple of things I noticed, but more often than not, it's going on the wrong shows and then not having the website, or if you do have a website, not just there's no way for people to get in contact with you, so you're kind of wasting that opportunity.
I love it. And then this is helpful. And this is all advice that it's easily corrected. And it's when you look at maybe someone else's flow or their funnel, it's easy enough to see if some of these things are broken. But if you yourself are in the middle of this, perhaps going it alone, you might have these blind spots of these sorts of things, of being on the wrong shows and maybe even having a website, but not having the discovery call, not having the contact information easily found. And that's what the whole point of this is, right? Like even you being on my show, at the end, we're going to mention your site. We're going to mention once they get to the site, what to do. And ideally, it's kind of like they listen to this podcast, they get a little bit of like all these samplings of different guests. And if there's something that they're looking for, something that they need, or that's been bugging them for a while, they say, oh my gosh, I need to be on podcast. I'm going to go to podcastingu.com, and you want them to like go there, but not just stop. You want them to like completely follow through, and you want to get these hot leads, as they call them. And so you have helped these real estate people get on the right podcasts, get investors, get funding, whatever it is, but get the right people listening to the show, then going to their site, contacting them, taking that next step. And then what's really exciting is you mentioned at the beginning here that you have since branched out to other alternative investing sort of opportunities, like investing in whiskey barrels, things like that. And so unpack that a little bit for us, because it sounds really cool. Like what other kind of niches have you ventured into, and what's that all about?
Yeah, most certainly. So it's been nice being in the real estate space, and we've been doing it for probably real estate exclusively, probably the last 3 or 4 years now. And it's like, okay, like we know the space, like how can we branch out, but not like branch out like too far where like we're in real estate specific, and then we work with like health and fitness people. Like that would be like too far branching out. That's not our specialty. So when we were looking at that, we're like, a lot of our clients, they're raising capital for their deals, and it's like, okay, what other companies are out there raising capital? And that's when we discovered, like you mentioned, this whiskey barrel company where you can invest in barrels of whiskey, companies where you can invest in laundry mats. I'm trying to think what else outside of oil and gas. That's been a really big thing. Minerals, wells, different things like that. Outside of that, what's the one? Oh, it's like a life insurance settlement company, which is that one's pretty interesting. Or what they'll, I don't know if it's grotesque or what the right word is, but basically you have $1 million policy and you want to get the cash on the policy. Now they'll go through and, as an example, they'll pay you $800,000 for your policy, and then when you pass away, they get the $1 million, so they net a profit of 200,000 on the policy. In a nutshell, that's how that works. And then you can invest in companies like that where you're buying part of that life insurance policy from the person. Obviously, if you have the cash, you could go buy the full policy from them, but maybe you just are a partial owner in it with a lot of other investors. So there's all these different asset classes or opportunities that people can invest in that are outside the real estate space, which has been pretty cool. And it's been enjoyable learning about them, talking to different people, especially the oil and gas, because that was definitely a niche where I didn't really know that much about, but it's pretty wild, all the different opportunities within that space. But it's been pretty good.
Yeah, no kidding. That the all around us, there's all these people making money in all these like clever and cool ways, but you just wouldn't know it just because. I mean, there's so much to learn, right? There's so much information out there, and all of them are a reason for these people that have these like investment opportunities, real estate and otherwise, to get on podcasts and to get some awareness, some education figured out. Because we've all been there, right? We've all said, hey, I'm interested in multifamily investing. And what do? Do you read a book? Well, maybe, but you also go on YouTube. You also listen to podcasts just because that's kind of I don't know. For somehow it's a less scary and deep way to learn as opposed to a book. A book, you think like, oh, I've got all these chapters and all this whole system, and if it's quite a commitment, right? If I choose some big thick book versus if I just tune into a podcast, I'm just like driving in my car, just checking out what this is all about. And so there's definitely this amazing opportunity that's been around for years, and it's around now and will be around for many years, of being on podcasts just to catch these people that maybe they're not quite ready to just contact someone directly or do a Google search or read a book. They're listening to a podcast first to figure out, well, who really knows their stuff. And so the website is podcastingyou.com. And is that the logical place to go after someone says, hey, like this whole guesting on podcasting idea is interesting. I want to find out more about what Trevor has. Where should they go? Is Podcasting You a great resource?
Yeah, that's perfect. They can just go to the podcastingyou.com, and then from there they can just book a discovery call with our company. And then from there, it's really just to get to know you, learn about more what you're looking to do, and see if it makes sense for you to go out there and start guesting on podcasts.
Wonderful. And you definitely practice what you preach, right? You said go to the website, but also book that discovery call. Don't just go there and leave. And so if you're the kind of person that you've listened this far on the podcast and this really interests you, and you've been kind of just like, taking a little bit of a sampling, now it's time to take that next step. And there's so many people that are on podcasts, people just like Trevor, who they take the time to be on a show, to explain some stuff, and they say, hey, I'm willing to give you this free call where we can just have a chat, figure out what your needs are. And am I right in saying here, Trevor, that like so few people actually take advantage of that? Like the percentage is really low as far as the people that just take a simple action step, such as booking a call with you?
Oh yeah, but I definitely agree with that.
So, I mean, be one of the few, right? Because so few people just kind of dabble and listen and say, oh, that's nice, but then they don't get anywhere. And like, what was the point otherwise of learning some of this stuff? Let's get Trevor to help you out and actually like get some progress made on this. And so podcastingyou.com is the place to go. And Trevor, you and I are a couple of podcasters, and you know that podcasts are fun when they end and kind of an exciting note. And so I like to try to stump my guests a slight bit at the end and ask for a quote or lesson that has helped them, that can help us. So it's time to stump you. What's coming to mind as far as a quote or lesson that you think will be helpful?
Yeah, if I could think back to a lesson for my company, because I'm trying to think of a quote. I'm thinking of a Steve Jobs quote, but it's like 2 paragraphs long, so it's not gonna it's gonna be hard to reiterate it. But when it comes to a lesson, it would probably be the biggest lesson I learned in my company, and it took some time, and it's having the opportunity to fire clients. That's been the biggest thing for me. And not to say I want to fire my clients that often, but every now and then you're going to get a client in your business, and it's just they're annoying to deal with. Honestly, at the end of the day, they're hounding you, they're asking for updates. Maybe they're not pleasant to work with. Just give them their money back or cancel the contract, whatever you have to do. That's been the biggest learning curve for me. And if I could recommend anyone out there, it's like it's harder in the beginning, but as you make more money in your company, you have the opportunity to go out there and fire a client. And that was something that was like very foreign to me. And that's what I recommend to anyone. It's like it's not worth it. I'd rather make a little bit less money, but work with clients that I want to work with. So that was just a big learning curve my business coach taught me and something I've implemented. Again, Not that I want to do it all that often. Maybe once a year that comes up, but it's just been a game changer. Instead of me stressing out, worrying about this client, it's like, you know what? We have 30 other clients we like working with. Why let one client ruin all the happiness that comes with running the company? So that was a big lesson I learned, and that's what I would recommend to anyone out there if you're dealing with a client that's just not enjoyable. It's really not worth it at the end of the day.
It's very logical, and like you said, it's not like a mean spirited thing. It's just not a good fit, and we've all been there, right? We've all like been like, why am I so stressed the
Mhm.
last few weeks? And you think like, you know what? It's just because of this one client, and if this one person just went elsewhere, it would really just reduce my stress by like 80% or more. And so that's a very hard learned lesson right there. Of if that one client is just stressing you out, it's not the end of the world. It's not mean. It's just sometimes these things don't work out. So very helpful and wonderful advice, Mr. Trevor Oldham from podcastingu.com. So if you want to be in this position where you can fire a client if need be, if you want to be in this position where you have credibility, where you have that media page where they say, hey, look, this person was on Bigger Pockets or they were on all these other shows and it looks really impressive and it builds your business, gives you networking, etc., then you need to stop going it alone. And you also need to avoid the trap of trying to just think about, oh, I'll do it in 2 months, I'll do it in 3 months. In 3 months, you'll be busier than you are now. So let Trevor and his team tell you what's possible, tell you what they'll do. That's podcastingyou.com. And thank you very much, Trevor, for stopping by and giving us a lot of ideas and advice and help as far as what we need to do, especially real estate investors, to enhance their presence and to just raise their prices and just get better results from their business. I really appreciate what you told us.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, perfect.